we're talking about Alfred Schutz. Schutz was writing around the Second World War. He was an Austrian who was trained in the Austrian circles. During the Anschluss, he fled to Paris and brought his family with him. And then, of course, the Nazis invaded France, and France surrendered. So again, he and his family had to flee. Immigrated to the United States July 14th, 1939. And then the work that he did during and following up the war would become the underlying establishment for a lot of where people like Berger and Luckman would go for the phenomenological side of sociology, the social construction theories, and eventually become ethnomethodology, and that kind of thing. A lot of that stuff kind of has its roots in Schutz and Schutz's work in social philosophy. Just like with Merleau-Ponty, I'm continuing on with this Luckman volume. I've got my overlay in the way. Phenomenology and Sociology, which is a collection of works that helped lead Thomas Luckman eventually into joining Berger in writing the social construction of reality, which is the basis of a whole bunch of the shit I do. So this is also part of the project that I'm working on now, because there's a gap sort of that I'm addressing in my research between the understanding of the development of otherness as a social theory and the understanding of otherness in individuals and through epistemology. And I'm trying to address this gap and bridge the things together. And this is sort of Luckman's journey through that through a very similar process. And so I want to hit this Schutz again in order to sort of really nail it down and to refresh myself with it now that I'm going to get started for credit again during the semester, instead of just upon my own recognizance as the world falls apart during the most chaotic summer of my 35 years on this godforsaken mudball of a planet. But I'm sure I digress. Anyway, let's see. Schutz and the Social Sciences. I actually thought that the title was The Social Philosophy of Alfred Schutz, but perhaps that is either something I made up, or it is a document in my possession somewhere, and this is not said document. In which case, I should probably find that document, because its title alone, it makes it very interesting to me. And then re-familiarize myself with that as well. Anyhow, I will start here. Alfred Schutz, Phenomenology in the Social Sciences, in Collected Papers, Volume 1. I'm still saying Schutz. I just learned it Schutz. And I keep saying Schutz, because I've been saying Schutz for like 7 years. I can't bring myself to do it properly. It's like how Du Bois is Du Bois, but it's spelled Dubois without an E. And so, like, being in the Boise area with Dubois, Les Dubois Park, etc., you think Dubois sort of automatically, but it's Du Bois, and you have to remember which one it is at the time when you're reading it, and it's just, anyway, life sucks and everything is chaos, and it's already hot in here. The fan's been off for like 15 minutes, and it's already hot. I'm so mad. Anyway, I gotta stop leaning into that mic, which should also not be in the shot. I cannot keep this mic out of the shot now with its new gooseneck. The new gooseneck is... I was like, fuck yeah, this gooseneck is crazy long. And now I'm mad because it's always in the way. Okay. Also, what are you doing way up here? Get in the... My microphones. They've gone rogue. All right. Originally in Philosophical Essays in Memory of Edmund Husserl. Oh, shit, I never did stream the Husserl thing. I'm going to have to go back and do that. Husserl is very interesting. Weird. Like, real weird. But, fun. In a intellectual kind of way. The Memory of Edmund Husserl edition... There's no number on the edition. It just says... whatever. M. Ferber, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 1940. Ooh, that's way earlier than I thought. I think Merleau-Ponty was writing the one that we were reading in 52. I thought this one was 52. No, Merleau-Ponty was 1960. What was the one that was in the 50s? Is there another one? I'm not reading the wrong Schutz, and the social philosophy of Schutz is in here somewhere else. Because I'm pretty sure they're by author. So there'd be 2 Schutz in a row, is my point. If there was more than one Schutz. Nope, right over here. Some structures. No. Was a totally different Schutz that I now intend to read, having found it. Give me this one. My business cards work a lot more often as bookmarks than they do as business cards because I do business with no one. Which is sort of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, my dream is dying and no one cares. But on the other hand, I don't have to put up with anybody's bullshit, which my life otherwise seems to be made exclusively up of. No, I'm not. This is not the wrong Schutz. Although it proves, well, it doesn't disprove that because it's in a different section. So the different section is also by author. Anyway, none of this matters. The significance of Husserl's phenomenology of the foundation of the social sciences will presumably become fully known only when the Husserl manuscripts, which are relevant to this problem, have been published. Which apparently, at this time, had not happened. I was under the impression they'd happened now. There's a whole story about a big part of the beginning of there's 2 parts to the beginning of the story of Jean-Paul Sartre, and one of them is, of course, the whole Heidegger misunderstanding that everybody goes on about because everybody's on Heidegger's dick all day long. Not that Heidegger's not great. I just think that's, I mean, it's a little much. But the other was that he had this weird idea about trying to find the philosophy in everyday life, and somebody was like, have you ever read Husserl? And then he went and he started going through Husserl's catalog, and was like, holy shit, this is the way some people actually do things. And so, like, a lot of the stuff that was behind the inspiration for Nausea and that whole angle of his various projects sort of got their start with reading Husserl. So there was a library for Husserl at the time that Jean-Paul Sartre was still writing into live. So I don't know if this is the words of Alfred Schutz in 1940, and that was not yet the case. Anyway, let's see. To be sure, the published works already contain the most important themes of thought pertaining to the subject. Husserl was consistently concerned with them from the time of writing the 6th logical investigation. But these important implicit themes remain scarcely noticed, not only because the extensive discoveries of phenomenology and the realm of pure logic and the general theory of knowledge have taken first place in the public discussions, but also because only in their latter writings of the master has the problem of the social sciences been attacked systematically. Even in these later writings, Husserl proceeded with great hesitation. As is known, he had completed a 2nd volume on the ideas in 1913, as far as proofreading. In this volume, the problems of personality, intersubjectivity, and culture were to have been treated. Just before publication, misgivings concerning the result of his work befell the scholar, who was always a model of conscientiousness. He recognized that the attack on these problems presupposed carrying out still further analysis, especially the clarification of the constitutive activities of consciousness. It's an author's note here. I'm not sure where the star is that it refers to, though, because I don't see the asterisk that indicates that I'm supposed to apply the author's notes to that point. Wish to express my gratitude to Professor Richard H. Williams, the University of Buffalo, for the great interest and the untiring efforts which he has devoted to the translation of my essay. The task of reproducing faithfully Husserl's language, with which in the original German offers serious problems even to German readers, is, I believe, really creative work. To Professor Marvin Ferber, I am deeply indebted for this kind interest and his careful supervision to the text. To Professor Fritz Malchip, I owe valuable suggestions concerning the English rendition. So, the thing about what's being discussed there that's really important to note academically is that, like, I was just listening the other day to a bunch of people having a discussion that they didn't realize involved a great deal of linguistic barriers because the English speakers assumed certain cultural norms could be imposed upon somebody speaking the English language who was Japanese. And I'm sitting here thinking, you have no idea what this conversation is because you don't, I barely know any Japanese, but I studied the culture for many years, and I can tell you that your approach to this conversation is radically outside of their realm of thought. They are not thinking about this the way that you are. They can't. Their whole worldview is based around subjectivities you just do not possess. Like, you are not a subject in the way that they are. You are a subject in these other ways that have been socialized along structural lines they have no access to. You are not communicating. You're both using the same language. You're not communicating. It's a dismal problem. It had to do with trans people not being treated with proper respect by somebody that didn't necessarily know how to properly treat trans people in an American culture, because their culture and the medium that they were using to express their view of their culture through treats it radically differently, and they couldn't find enough common ground for this conversation because each believed the other to be communicating within the framework that they themselves understood, since they were speaking the same language. But a Japanese person who learns, German philosophy is bonkers. The Germans have got a word for just about every damn thing in the universe, and a lot of things that don't actually really exist. But if they did, the Germans would have a word for it, which is very specifically that thing, but only when it's cloudy on a Wednesday, right? And no other language bothers with shit like that. There's a lot of shit that the Germans just say with a word that we would have to use whole sentences to try to describe and explain. So translating is very difficult. Derrida has a whole bunch of shit on that. Like, a lot of what Derrida's work was actually in translation and understanding it in this like purely linguistic way, or the difference between a purely linguistic way, as in the rules of a language, and what a person is communicating through a language when you translate it from one language into another language. I think Levinas did some things like that. There's a lot of people who translated the Bible who have a lot of things to say about the way that the world works that are insights based on trying to understand this process. Because these are two sort of radically different things. Communicating something within a language and then having to translate that into another language is so different from understanding what the rules of any particular language is, right? That, it's its own philosophical adventure. It's its own academic branch on top of what it is you're trying to translate. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it's worth discussing a section like that. So when we're talking about Husserl here, that changes it, right? Because I was talking about how, I kind of thought that there was access to Husserl because of the stuff that was happening in France. But here is Schutz talking about working with American theorists in order to get an English version for Americans, right? And was personally involved in that notion. And so this reference is not to, we're dealing with a world in which we don't have access to the works of Husserl because they haven't been translated. He means the project I am currently involved in for trying to translate Husserl is important because. That radically changes this whole fucking work. So this author's note has changed the entire meaning of this paper and its purpose. There is a mission statement hidden in the opening. You're very careful when you read stuff like that too. Like, if something is old, Like, because the way that we write things now is extremely formulaic. And that formula is extremely useful, right? They hammer that formula fucking into you when you're in college. They're like, yeah, it's the introduction, body, conclusion. This is how you do things. Here's your thesis statement, blah, 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 blah. People in the 1930s and 40s didn't write like that. But everything that we do right now is by and large based on shit people were writing in the 30s and 40s. Because there was a massive intellectual transformation between what was going on before that time and during that time. And an incredible amount of learning that had to take place because we had to figure out what the fuck happened during the World Wars, which were just awful. And everything that we had understood to be normal or true about society had to be called into question because it led to the most destructive elements of human history. I was going to say, because there's a lot of unpacking to do there, and I don't have time for it because I have to go on with this fucking book. It was in the first formal and transcendental logic that the avenue of approach was opened to this new thematic field. But again, it proceeded from the point of view of purely logical problems. In this work can also be found the starting points toward considerations which were carried further in the postscript to the English translation of the Ideen, and in the Fifth Cartesian Meditation, both written in 1931, and which would have found their complete presentation in the extensive series of essays planned under the title The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology. A bunch of German shit is in the first footnote, and the second footnote is also German shit. The title's in German of the shit I said, I guess. Although Ideen was in German, wasn't it? Formal Transcendental Logic, Translation, Dorian, Cairns, etc., etc. Certainly nothing as interesting as the author's note at the beginning. That changed what we were reading quite dramatically. In the last conversations which the writer had the good fortune of having with Husserl, he repeatedly designated the series of essays as the summary and crowning achievement of his life's work. He was working continuously on them during the last years of his life, but only the first essay appeared in the Journal of Philosophy, Philosophia, Belgrade, 1936. Then death took the pen from Husserl's hand, and only the penetrating fragment which appeared in the Revue Internationale des Philosophes, the question about the origin of geometry, gives an indication of the extent of the work which had been begun in this period. Also published in Brussels, apparently. There is another editor's note that is not in here. In the following paragraphs of this essay, an attempt will be made to trace in concise form the initial phases of the phenomenological foundation of the social sciences, which are contained in the writings referred to above. Following this, in the second part of the essay, the question concerning the independence of the social sciences will be raised, and, going beyond Husserl, an inquiry will be made concerning the contribution which phenomenology can make to their concrete methodological problems. Stumbling over the English in that one for some reason. It goes without saying that all this must be limited to inadequate intimations. I mean, lots of this kind of thing has to be. Because how else can you address it? There has to be abstraction. I did a whole presentation on levels of abstraction, and a lot of the philosophy students just wouldn't have it on the grounds that they wanted to feel like they didn't have to accept that. They wanted to believe that a person was capable of open-heart surgery after a conversation rather than several years of medical school because it was convenient to their worldview. And that seems to be, to me, how most students operate nowadays. By whatever is most convenient to their worldview, because they are entitled to having the college experience, which I could define very carefully for you if I had the time. I do not. Anyway, let's see. Continuing on, all sciences, be they related to the objects of nature or to so-called cultural phenomena, are, for Husserl, a totality of human activities, namely, those of scientists working together. The fact of science itself belongs to that realm of objects which must be clarified by the methods of cultural sciences, which in German are referred to, holy shit, well, that's a word, are referred to as Geistwissenschaften. Geistwissenschaften. You see what I mean? Why do you need one word for all that shit? Geistwissenschaften. Furthermore, the basis of meaning, Sinnfundament, in everyday sciences is the pre-scientific life world, Lebenswelt. Ah, I knew that one. I'm familiar with Lebenswelt, which is the one and unitary life world of myself, of you, and all of us. That is not how I have used it. Let's go over that again. We're going to go back up to that first paragraph where shit starts getting German on us. The fact that science itself belongs to that realm of objects which must be clarified by the methods of cultural sciences. Is getting German ahead of myself there. The cultural sciences, which in German are referred to as I just said it. Geistwissenschaften. Furthermore, are the basis of meaning, Sinnfundament, in every science is the pre-scientific life world, Lebenswelt, which is the one and unitary life world of myself, of you, and of all of us. Now, I never thought of Lebenswelt as being something you could universalize. So life world is made up of interacting life ways. So like the life ways of people that interact could form a life world, right? This is the way that a person interacts with the world that they have encountered, but it's somewhat relative to one extent or another because it's not necessarily the same as the results of interaction with another part of other interconnected societies. For example, the life ways of the German people are not necessarily the same life ways of the Austrian people, but close enough that the Anschluss that caused him to have to flee Austria took place, right? And that was because of the life world of Central Europe at that time. But that wasn't the same as the life ways of the peoples even in Eastern Europe, let alone the United States, or other parts of the world like the Commonwealth, right? The British Commonwealth. Were experiencing vastly different kinds of life worlds if you are using that view to address it, if that's how we're looking at it. Right. But what this is suggesting, I think, is that we're seeing an attempt to use scientific methodology in order to examine a universal existence. But the universal existence precedes the examination, and people living within it are the ones doing the examining, right? So, I mean, that statement is something very similar to a cornerstone in postmodernism. The idea that in order for us to start addressing what is going on around us, we have to understand that we are in what is going on around us before the address begins, and to ignore that would be foolhardy. Basis of meaning in every science is the pre-scientific life world, right? Everything that we come to understand through scientific methodology is still couched in the reality that we went into it having experienced, regardless of our understanding of that. So the things that we take for granted that we do understand become the groundwork of the results of scientific methodology imposed upon examining that life world in which we live. So you're going to be in a constant state of failing to totally purify that into scientific methodology because it's always going to be polluted by the experiences that lead up to that. An example that Judith Butler uses is we learn from the Bible that God made man and woman And because we know from the Bible that God made man and woman, atheists eventually discovered the chromosomes that make men and women. That's not at all what happened. That's just how they thought about it, because even though they had all these reasons to, for lack of a better explanation, know better, the framework that was used historically to get them to that point was already flawed, but was groundwork that had been laid and that they had lived their entire lives being exposed to. So when they implement that idea, they struggle with it, and it turns out that things are a lot more complicated than the X and Y chromosomes leading to people wearing dresses or suits, right? Like, there are whole elements of the human experience that you cannot explain simply with genetics. And even the things that you can explain with genetics don't fit the explanations we expected, because our expectations, despite us being in a position where we might have known better, were based on the life world in which we had had our experiences up to that point. So when we were asking the question, what gene makes someone wear a dress, we were already asking the wrong question. The question itself was wrong, because there was never going to be a gene that decided how society negotiated its gender politics, right? And it was kind of stupid to assume that there would be. And that's how you can look at the way that gender is different in different cultures, and that it has changed across time. Even the way that people exercise sexuality has changed so radically across time that it makes it impossible to assume that a gene could make someone gay, above and beyond the question, how the hell do you transfer gay genes? Because you would think that gay genes would have a tendency not to proliferate in a species, right? Stands to reason. So there have to be more complicated answers to the questions. But if you're raised in the life world in which evolution and or genetics has to be the answer to every one of your questions, how do you address the question? You have to step outside of your life ways in order to do it. But all you know is your life ways, because you're using the same scientific methodology to study it as came up with the conclusions that built those life ways in the first place, in a time of ignorance, before we'd learned as much as we had from that process. So it's a constant cycle. It's a constant cycle running through a filter that will only ever get so clean. There's probably a point at which you can say, yeah, that's good enough. Like triple filtered vodka. Once you get to a triple filtered vodka, you're probably not filtering much out unless you're using some kind of membrane to turn it into pure alcohol. Which is not necessarily better. You're just making lighter fluid at that point. The insight into this foundational nexus can become lost in the course of the development of a science through the centuries. It must, however, be capable in principle of being brought back into clarity, which, through making evident the transformation of meaning, which this life world itself has undergone during the constant process of idealization and formalization, which comprises the essence of scientific achievement. So one of the ways in which that gets really complicated is like when you're looking at stuff that developed throughout the period of race theory, right? Because there's a bunch of shit that comes out of that when you're like, these are methodologies and they work like this and they seem to be effective, but they're born out of these original flawed policies and pseudoscience. And you're like, well, do we even keep it at that point? Like, do we try to address that in some way that makes this salvageable? Do we start over, right? What do you do? And I think that in a lot of cases, we just decided that had to be ignored. And I think that Schutz would find that extremely problematic based on this clause here. Clause? Is that an appropriate passage? Based on this passage. Where did all these rings go? There's rings everywhere, and the place that I put them away at is not. And it's fucking hot. The temperature is slowly climbing, and I have a show tonight in a game that is going to cripple my cooling system. The insights into the fundamental process, yes. It must, however, be capable in principle of being brought back into clarity. Yes, see, that's what I mean. Through making evident the transformation of meaning which the life world itself has undergone during the constant process of idealization and formalization, which comprises the essence of scientific achievement. See, like, That phrase there also makes it very difficult for me to accept that there are so many people who were being educated by these materials complaining about postmodernism.